Hi, this is Frank, and welcome back to The Next Realignment. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the Republican Party's search for a new identity after the New Deal, and the clash between the conservatives under Robert Taft and the establishment under Tom Dewey. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the Republican Party in the wake of FDR's New Deal. The time at which the Republicans, now a shattered political party and a weak political minority, had to find themselves once again. They had to figure out, well, in this new era with this New Deal revolution, what is it that the Republicans were going to stand for and believe? And I think most important to the Republicans, how were they ever going to get themselves back in office? How were they going to win elections? How were they ever going to get themselves back into the White House? This had created a looming question over all of Republican politics. One that created two factions. One faction that came to be called the conservatives, and another faction which came to be called the establishment, or sometimes by the 1960s, the Rockefeller Republicans, named after the leader of that era, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. This sort of dispute between the conservatives and the establishment in the middle of the 20th century is one that is fundamentally misunderstood. It's usually presented to people as a question of political philosophy, that there was a conservative faction and they were on the right and they wanted to philosophically pull the Republican Party right. And then the establishment faction, they were more moderate. They wanted to pull the party towards the middle, if not even into the center left, to create a progressive Republican Party. But that's not really correct. Because what you have to understand about the conservatives and the establishment is they didn't actually disagree much about philosophy. Philosophically, they were all Republicans. They were Republicans that had come out of the fight over the New Deal, which meant they opposed the New Deal. They opposed New Deal liberalism. They thought that New Deal liberalism was a sort of a threat potentially to liberty and to American virtue. And they believed this. That's why they were Republicans in the first place. If they didn't believe that, they would have been Democrats. Their fight wasn't really over ideology or philosophy or ideas. Their fight was over tactics. Each faction had a different idea about what the party needed to do if they were ever going to win elections again. Tactically, how were they going to interpret their philosophy? How were they going to carry it out in policy? How were they going to present themselves to the electorate so they could ever win elections again after several election losses in a row and sort of a desperate political situation? As these two factions would start to form within the Republican Party, each found that they would need a leader. And the conservatives, they turned to the Republican Party's leader in Congress, the senator from Ohio, son of a former president, Senator Robert Taft. The establishment, they looked to New York. The governor of New York, Tom Dewey, a former prosecutor who had risen to fame by taking on the mob and taking down Lucky Luciano, gone on to become governor of New York and a very popular governor of a very populous state. And these two men, they viciously disagreed about how the Republican Party was ever going to win again and what it needed to do. But they also each really wanted to control the Republican Party because they wanted to use it as a springboard to the presidency. And this fight between these two men, between Taft and Dewey, it came to define sort of not just the internal politics of the party, but the direction that the party would go in throughout the 20th century, all the way up to the days of Ronald Reagan. So long as Franklin Roosevelt was in the White House, the Republican Party was something of a mess because Franklin Roosevelt was wildly popular. His New Deal was widely credited with saving America from the Great Depression, and then he went on to lead the country through the Second World War, where the Republican Party was still reviled. It was reviled as the party of Herbert Hoover, the party that had caused the crisis in the first place. And in election after election, the Republican Party would put forth candidates where they would attack FDR. They would call him a tyrant, and they would say the New Deal was a mistake. And if they got into office, they promised America that they were going to undo everything FDR had done. Now, a lot of these candidates themselves were people that we would probably, by modern terms, consider quite moderate. And the candidate in 1936 was Alf Landon, a guy who had been a progressive Republican in the era before the New Deal. The candidate in 1940 was Wendell Willkie. Wendell Willkie was a business person with very limited political experience who later on would actually go on to help FDR. And then the candidate in 1944 was none other than Thomas Dewey, a guy who, as governor, had called himself a pay-as-you-go liberal. He said that he was happy with social spending so long as there was money available to pay for it. And he had even at one point called himself a New Deal Republican. But the campaigns that the Republicans ran in those years, those you wouldn't really call moderate at all. And they weren't moderate because they didn't just attack the New Deal as a philosophy. And they didn't just promise that if the Republicans won, they were going to stop Democrats from further advancing their agenda. The Republicans in those years basically had promised America that if they won, they were going to take the New Deal apart. All these programs and policies and institutions, they were going to undo them. And the American people hearing that message pretty soundly rejected them. And the Republican Party, in election after election, pretty much got crushed. But then, in 1945, something happened. Franklin Roosevelt passed away. And not long after that, the Second World War came to an end. And Harry Truman ascended to the presidency. Harry Truman was no FDR. He was something of what people considered an accidental president. He'd only risen to the Senate from obscurity in the first place as a tool of the local Democratic political machine who had installed him there as sort of a loyal member of the machine. He'd only become vice president in 1944 because Democratic Party bosses were concerned that Henry Wallace, the existing vice president under FDR, was too progressive, and that if FDR happened to die and Wallace had become president, he was going to take the party even farther, and they were concerned about that, and they needed to throw him off the ticket, and Truman was a convenient compromise candidate that everybody could live with. So the Republican Party now, as the 1948 election started to loom, realized that they had a chance. For the first time in over 15 years, they had a chance to get back into the White House. FDR, he had been unbeatable. But Harry Truman, that was a man they thought that they could beat. And that meant that the nominating contest in 1948 would take on great importance to the Republican Party. It would be the most important election for them, they thought, in probably a generation. If they were ever going to get back into the White House, they needed to win. The conservative candidate that year was, as we said, Robert Taft. Robert Taft had been a staple of Republican politics by then. He had been one of the leaders in the Senate of the conservative coalition that had ultimately stopped the advance of the New Deal in the 1930s. He, throughout the 1940s, had been a stalwart opponent of the advance of the New Deal and FDR. And now, in 1946, he had essentially taken control of Congress. Because when FDR had passed away and the war had ended, the American people were really looking for a change. And the change they tried out was putting the Republicans in control of Congress. And as the most important Republican in Congress, that meant putting the Congress in the hands of Robert Taft. Harry Truman had famously dismissed this Congress as the Republican do-nothing Congress, but that's not really fair. I mean, that's from a Democratic perspective. The Democrats thought the point of Congress was to do things, to advance New Deal liberalism. That's not what Robert Taft thought. Robert Taft thought the point of Congress was to undo things, was to stop the Democrats from advancing their agenda and to start taking parts of the New Deal apart. And that is what he had sought to do. And now, from that perch, he was ready to be elevated to the presidency to take his war against the New Deal all the way into the White House. The establishment, they had rallied around the candidate of 1944, Tom Dewey. Now, Tom Dewey, he's a very different figure from somebody like Robert Taft. Robert Taft is dour. He's serious. He's uncompromising. He doesn't want to stop this fight against the New Deal. But Tom Dewey, he's young. He's still in his mid-40s, and he's already run for president once. He is energetic. He sees himself as something of a reformer. Now, a different kind of reformer from the Democrats. He doesn't believe in the New Deal philosophy, but he thinks we can take the Republican philosophy, sort of a small government philosophy, to actually solve problems, run things more efficiently, and to make things better. There were other candidates in 1948. There was also Harold Stassen, the former governor of Minnesota, who was seen as something as a arch-progressive candidate for the Republican Party. There was also Arthur Vandenberg, who was sort of a standby candidate who some Republicans were looking to if this fight between Taft and Dewey couldn't get resolved. But ultimately, the nomination was going to come down between one of these two guys, Taft or Dewey. But the Republican Party didn't yet really appreciate the gravity of the choice that they were making. They gave the nomination to Dewey, and a lot of their reasoning went like this. Taft was boring. He was dour. He was uncompromising. He had alienated a lot of people. Dewey, he's more exciting. He'd done a pretty good job running against FDR in 1944. He's sort of younger. He's a better candidate. And if he'd almost been able to beat FDR, surely he could beat Harry Truman. Tom Dewey now is the nominee. He goes out and starts campaigning, and he throws all the anti-New Deal history of the 1930s Republican Party away. He runs a very different campaign than he did in 1944, where he had fought against the New Deal. He's now running a sunny campaign about the future. He's looking ahead to tomorrow. He's avoiding a lot of these specifics. He's not attacking the New Deal. And people like him. He's pretty popular. And it looks like he's going to win. Particularly because Harry Truman, again, not nearly as popular as a president as FDR. The Democratic Party also split that year. There were two other third-party candidates of prominent Democrats. The segregationist Strom Thurmond, who's coming in from one side, also jilted former progressive Vice President Wallace, is hitting him from the other side. If a handful of votes in a handful of states had gone a different way, Dewey probably would have been president. But fate says that that's not the way things were meant to be. And Dewey's loss in 1948 throws the Republican Party into a spiral of anger and fear. Because it was one thing to lose election after election against FDR. To lose over a decade of elections against a giant like FDR, hey, that's something you can maybe come back from. But to lose against Harry Truman, Republicans started to wonder, maybe they'd never win another election again. Maybe this was the end of the party itself. And that set off a war, a 4-year war within the Republican Party for its direction. The election of 1952 was a do or die event. And the Republican Party now had to decide what it was going to be, what it was going to stand for, and how it was going to ever win a national election again. The Republican Party found itself fiercely divided about what exactly had gone wrong. How had the Republican Party once again lost an election, this time an election that they really should have won? Now, Taft and his supporters, they looked at what had happened in 1948, and what they saw was this. They thought Tom Dewey had failed to present an adequate sort of contrast between the Republican Party and its ideas and the Democratic Party and its ideas. His sunny campaign about the future that was short on specifics and refused to directly attack the New Deal, it hadn't given the American people an adequate reason to change horses. The Democrats had now been in power for years. The American people were more or less happy with what they had done. So if the Republican Party was going to convince America to try them out for a change, it had to give them a good reason. It had to explain why their ideas were different and why their ideas were better and why the Democrats' ideas were a mistake. So Taft and his supporters, they thought if the Republican Party was ever going to win again for the presidency, they needed to keep attacking the New Deal. They needed to explain why the Republican critique of the New Deal and New Deal liberalism itself was the correct one. Dewey and his partisans, they saw the exact opposite situation. They looked at the 1948 election and they thought it was evidence that they were right. See, Dewey had very nearly won. It had been the best performance by any Republican going back to 1932. Tom Dewey, for the first time, stopped directly attacking the New Deal, and the American people very nearly made him president. So Dewey and his supporters in the establishment, they thought that meant that they were on the right path. They were traveling in the right direction, and if they just continued on and did more of what Dewey had done in 1948, next time the Republicans would win. To do what Taft was recommending, going back to a strategy the Republicans had tried in election after election after election and failed, to Dewey and his supporters, that looked like political suicide. So these two factions, they now went to war over the next 4 years for control of the party and control of the party's direction. And it was a fight that they both saw as sort of essential to the Republican Party's fate, that it had now been out of power for 20 years. If it couldn't win in 1952, what was the point of the party at all? They thought the party itself could even die. Taft, he naturally started out as the frontrunner because Tom Dewey, he'd been fatally wounded by his loss in 1948. He'd now run for president twice. He'd lost twice. The Republican Party was not going to take a chance on what would be a 3-time loser. And Tom Dewey and everybody knew there was no way he was ever going to win the nomination for president ever again himself. So Taft, as sort of the second great figure in the party, he now stood to inherit the presidency. So Dewey and his supporters in the establishment, they realized they needed somebody else. That while Tom Dewey would remain sort of the brain of the establishment faction, they needed a new frontman. They needed somebody to put at the top of the ticket who wasn't named Dewey. So they looked around and they tried to find a candidate, somebody who agreed with their perspective and would kind of go along with what the establishment wanted to do. And they thought they found the perfect candidate, the hero of the Second World War, Dwight Eisenhower. As the hero who had managed America's victory in the Second World War, Dwight Eisenhower was obviously on the top of everybody's list as a future American president. And in fact, both parties at certain times had reached out to him to see if he would run as a candidate. But Eisenhower, he'd always considered himself a Republican. So when Dewey and his faction reached out to him, he decided that he'd heed the call and throw his hat in as a Republican candidate under the support and tutelage of Dewey and his faction of the Republican Party. So the 1952 Republican National Convention was fated to pit these two factions and these two men. The conservative faction, headed by Robert Taft, and Dewey's establishment faction, now headed by General Dwight Eisenhower. Now, there were other candidates also in the mix, of course, people like Douglas MacArthur and Earl Warren and Harold Stassen once again. But the heart of the convention would come down to this big fight. And it was one of the most bitter and angry conventions in all of American political history. With each of these two factions going to war against each other, there were harsh words said, there were fights over seating delegates, and both factions saw that this sort of battle at the convention wasn't just about picking a nominee for president, but picking a direction for the future of the Republican Party. And the voting, ultimately, it was really close. Taft got closer than he ever did to finally getting his chance to be the nominee for president. But ultimately, he just wasn't able to beat the hero of World War II. And Eisenhower, he would go on to run a campaign a lot like Dewey's campaign in 1948. He would run a sunny campaign about the future. He would focus on issues like foreign policy. And most important, he would not be attacking the New Deal. He was not going to promise America that if he won election, he was going to take apart all the popular institutions and programs that FDR had put in place. And he had a sunny, positive message with a slogan that everybody liked, which was, "I like Ike." And on that, he won the presidency. He crushed the Democratic candidate, Adlai Stevenson, becoming the first Republican to get back into the White House since FDR. As president, Dwight Eisenhower would govern more or less the same way that he had promised in his campaign. He wasn't going to be taking on the New Deal directly or trying to undo the things that FDR had done. He would focus instead on issues like foreign policy or infrastructure or, very important to him, administration. He saw his leadership of America much the same way that he saw his previous leadership of the Army. He wanted to be a competent administrator, doing the best of his ability to run the institutions that had been put into his charge. As for Taft and the conservatives, really just a few months after the campaign, Robert Taft unfortunately learned that he had cancer. So really about a year into Eisenhower's presidency, Robert Taft passed away. And with his passing, the faction of the party that he had led started to sort of crumble and fall apart. Now with the leadership of the party in the hands of Dwight Eisenhower and the establishment. As president, Eisenhower was pretty popular. He was easily reelected 4 years later, so that by the time of 1960, after 8 years in office, the perspective of Dwight Eisenhower, which was the perspective of Tom Dewey and the establishment, had now just kind of become the perspective of the Republican Party as a whole. The 1952 election had essentially resolved this big question looming over the Republican Party since the New Deal had begun. See, everybody involved, they pretty much agreed. They agreed that the New Deal had been a mistake. They didn't like New Deal liberalism as a philosophy of government. And they all had signed on to the Republican Party's ideology that had come out of the New Deal. This idea that the New Deal agenda needed to be limited where possible to make sure it didn't infringe on other American values. Values like liberty or virtue. The fight, which was often quite a fierce and angry fight, was just a question of tactics. It was a question of, given the political realities of the middle 20th century, how should the Republican Party present itself to the electorate? How should it translate this ideology that everybody agreed with into action? What agenda should it pursue when it wins office? What should it do? How should it campaign? What should it say when Republican candidates are running for election? And on these questions, the Republican Party had been very divided because Taft and his conservative faction, they didn't want to give up the fight. They'd been fighting since the 1930s to reverse what FDR had done, and they wanted to keep charging forward into the guns. They thought that if they continued to present to America a square argument that the New Deal had been a mistake and that it was a mistake that could be undone, the American people would eventually put them in power and allow them to start undoing it. But the establishment, they thought that was political suicide. They thought the Republicans had done that. They had tried it in election after election after election. And the American people had time and again rejected the argument. Now, it didn't mean that they had to become New Deal liberals themselves. There's plenty of things they still could do using the Republican ideology. They could stop Democrats from further advancing the New Deal agenda. They could try to make sure that there was always money available to pay for what the Democrats wanted to do. And if the Democrats went too far and wanted to do too much, they could try to limit it to keep it within a budget. They could also try to create their own tools. They could create Republican tools under their ideology that they thought wouldn't step on the liberty and virtue that Democratic plans might do. So when Democrats came up with new ideas, they could use Republican counterproposals using things like markets to achieve the same goals in a different way. They could also just simply administer the government that the Democrats had created better, they thought, than the Democrats would do. And they could come to America and say, hey, this has all been done, but we, the Republicans, you can trust us to run it better than you can trust the Democrats. But one thing they thought you could not do, and they thought that facts had proven this to be correct, you could not go to America ever again and promise to actually start taking apart the New Deal agenda. You could not start killing off programs, destroying agencies, starting taking apart new institutions. What has been done, they thought, has been done. But not everybody agreed with this new consensus. While Taft and his old conservative faction was now fading from influence, a new group was starting to form. A group who also thought that the establishment had gotten some big things wrong. And this group was mostly made up of younger people. People who hadn't taken part directly in the fights against FDR in the 1930s. And these younger people, they started to coalesce around a leader, a guy by the name of William F. Buckley Jr., who'd founded a little magazine called National Review. And this group, a new right, if you will, started to take on a name, and that name was the conservative movement. And the story of the rise of that conservative movement, that is what we will be talking about next. Thanks a lot for watching, and if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give it a like and subscribe to the channel. And make sure you tune into the next episode, because we're going to be talking about the rise of the conservative movement.